Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. President Trump Friday night declined to release a classified Democratic memo rebutting GOP claims that the FBI abused its power to spy on a former Trump campaign advisor. The White House sending a letter to the House Intelligence Committee asking it to work with the Department of Justice to remove sensitive material from the 10-page document. Democrats are calling the move politically motivated and hypocritical. But the president responded Saturday morning, tweeting, "The Democrats sent a very political and long response memo, which they knew, because of sources and methods and more, would have to be heavily redacted," whereupon they would blame the White House for lack of transparency, told them to redo and send back in proper form. Let's bring in Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger and columnist Kim Strassel. So, Dan, what do you make of the president's decision to say send it back and not declassify and renegotiate?
Well, we have not seen the Democrats' memo. We don't know what was redacted. We have to assume that since they talked to FBI Director Christopher Wray and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein about the content of that memo, that there is something substantive at the center of it. I mean, Mr. Wray and Rosenstein had their own letter, which they sent simultaneously to the Democrats, raising these questions. And I have to say, Paul, God knows what the American people are making of this right now. I mean, they must feel like they've been sucked into a John le Carré novel. It's hard enough for us to try to figure out. We've got our own sources and methods. And so you've got one set of memos dueling with another set of memos. But I have to say, go back to the beginning of this. This is ultimately about whether Trump was colluding with the Russians. From day one, that has always been kind of a shaky story. And I always wondered, how are they actually going to nail down and verify that something like this collusion was taking place? And I think the difficulty of that is being played out right now in these memos.
Kim, on this memo, the Democratic memo, 10 pages, the Republican memo, only 4. So just on its face and its length, the chances increase that you could get some compromising of sensitive material. But I have to say, my view is Trump ought to not play this game of this memo, that memo. Just get the original FISA application out in toto. Lets the American people see it, and all 4 of them, frankly. We know it was re-upped 3 times. Let them see it all.
Look, and they've had so much time to do this now, and instead they just spent another 5 days letting Democrats play this game. They've been in possession of this memo for that long, and it was pretty clear from the start. My sources say that this was sent up to him in a way that did contain information that was going to put the White House all along in a position where they had to say something about redactions, and then Democrats could turn around and say, you've got a double standard, you're hiding something. Just get it out there. Get the FISA application out there. Finish unredacting the Grassley referral letter that went out this week that has to do with Christopher Steele, and some of the 302 forms, the interviews that the FBI did with their sources. Let the American public see what really happened.
All right, let's turn to that Grassley-Graham, Lindsey Graham, Chuck Grassley letter on the Christopher Steele dossier. What did we learn from that this week? Because there was some pretty interesting information.
Well, as Dan was saying, look, all of this hinges on whether or not Donald Trump, there's any evidence he colluded with Russians. And the problem now, increasingly, is that entire case is falling apart in terms of the original evidence that was put forward, which is, of course, this dossier paid for by the Clinton campaign and the DNC through an Oppo research firm and ultimately Christopher Steele. And the Grassley referral, what was so important about it this week is it dismantled Christopher Steele's credibility, and that it showed that he was out talking to the press, even though the FBI had told him not to. That was undermining the FBI probe, and that he potentially lied to the FBI about having done so.
All right, but there's another thing that's interesting that we learned here, and that is a couple of names from the Clinton era have appeared. Sidney Blumenthal and Cody Shear, longtime friends of Hillary Clinton. And it turns out, Kim, that they may have played a role in getting some information to Steele. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they didn't may have. It did happen. We now know that not only was the Clinton campaign funding this dossier effort, but it was providing information that went into the dossier. They came up with some reports. They funneled them to a middleman at the Obama State Department, a guy who'd worked for John Kerry, and he got them on to Mr. Steele, who incorporated them into his dossier. So this is another reason to wonder, look, if you're a super spy, like Christopher Steele has been presented, does it not fail your sniff test to go out and start putting information from noted political operators into your research?
And yet James Comey, the former FBI director, under whom all of this happened, said, well, we trusted Steele because we knew him. But look, with all of this complicated partisan and political ties and potential motivation, this just makes the case even more to get it all out, to see what they were looking at, so that the American public doesn't have to say, well, I trust this Republican because I'm a Republican, I trust Republicans, or vice versa. Let's see who it really is telling the truth.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think, Paul, there has to be an effort here to, and I hope Christopher Wray is doing this, restore the credibility of the FBI, who was handling this material back then while Jim Comey was director of the FBI. Clearly, there were some significant errors of judgment made during the Comey era, and now we have to get past that. And I think the only way to do it is to let it all hang out.
All right, when we come back, lawyers for President Trump reportedly advising him against sitting down with special counsel Robert Mueller, despite the potential legal and political fallout. So what should the president do? We'll ask former White House counsel Boyden Gray next. Should he or shouldn't he? The White House still weighing whether President Trump will speak with special counsel Robert Mueller. The president's lawyers have reportedly advised him against sitting down for a wide-ranging interview with Mueller and are instead looking to have Trump answer as many questions as possible in writing. The president told reporters in January that he was looking forward to testifying under oath. So what should he do? Let's ask C. Boyden Gray. He served as White House counsel to President George H.W. Bush. So welcome, Boyden. What would you recommend that the president do, drawing on your experience of advising presidents?
Well, I don't think he can duck everything to do with Mueller, and I don't think he should. But he should try to get a very constrained, limited interview, if it's that, better interrogatories. But if it has to be in person, he'll have his lawyers there. The central problem is there really is no scope limit to what Mueller is investigating, and therefore would be no limit to what he could ask. And the lawyers have to get some sort of constraint on that. Otherwise, you couldn't prepare the president. He couldn't prepare for it because you wouldn't know what you were being asked.
Well, what about the idea that he should just say no and say, look, I'm not going to cooperate. I don't have to, particularly if he can't get that narrow writ on the questions that you suggested.
Well, then he Mueller could go to a grand jury and get a subpoena, and then he's in the grand jury room without a lawyer at all, and that's not good either. That's worse.
Right, that's
so
worse.
There's leverage. There's leverage that Mueller has, and let's hope he doesn't abuse it, because there has to be some limit to what this discussion will cover.
But does that limit really ultimately stand on the goodwill or the forbearance of Mueller? Because, as you say, he has some leverage here, could take a subpoena to the grand jury, which would, I think, make the president look bad politically if he didn't cooperate voluntarily. But ultimately, is it really up to Mueller, or can the president's lawyers really insist on a set of written questions?
I think they could, and I think they could justifiably test Mueller's willingness to go to a grand jury for a broader, unlimited inquiry. And I think the public would react adversely to that. But that does assume that there is some willingness to cooperate at some level, and I think Trump would lose that if he refused outright to even consider. Okay,
when you say narrow the questions here, right now Mueller is, as you know, the special counsel's order from Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, is very, very broad. But you're suggesting that the lawyers should say, look, Mr. Mueller, are you going to ask us about the firing of Jim Comey? Are you going to ask us about Carter Page? Are you going to ask us about this or that? And just narrow it to 2, 3, or 4 things, maybe even fewer, and say, all right, we'll answer those, but we don't want this to be an open-ended, hour-long, 2-hour-long session.
That's correct. That's what I think they should ask for, and I think that's what they could get if they were precise and clear to the independent counsel staff that this will not look good in the public if they turn this or wanted this into a real inquisition into everything in his life.
Okay. Let me ask you about something else based on your experience. And you've seen the story this week with Rob Porter, a White House aide, alleged to have abused a couple of former wives. He resigned this week. He denies the facts as have been presented by his accusers. But I want to talk to you about the process by which a White House vets somebody like that on the staff. You get FBI reports in the White House counsel's office, correct? And it would
correct.
And it would probably include such information. What do you do then if you're the White House counsel?
Well, they're judgment calls always, and I think that there's no reason to expect the White House counsel and the others in the White House to have rejected his being hired into this very important job, which he's apparently done extremely well, just on the basis of a couple of allegations. The trouble is, for any employee, potential employee, staff member, is the security clearance. That's right. When the going gets tough. And in this case, it looked as though the going was too tough. He wasn't getting his security clearance, and that's the acid test. At some point, then the staff, the White House chief of staff has, or the White House counsel has to fish or cut bait and say, I'm sorry, you can't get, they're not going to give you security clearance, and so you can't stay in this job. The president has the right to reverse a recommendation of no security clearance, but I don't think that's ever happened. At least it didn't happen when I was there.
So the FBI actually makes a recommendation, and then the White House counsel, neither the White House counsel nor the White House chief of staff can overrule that. Only the president can. Is that
I think only the president can overrule that. That's the practice. I don't think that's in any statute. That's just the practice.
Okay. But if you would get this kind of information, you would go first to the person who's accused and talk to him about it, right? I assume. And then
yes.
would you take it to the chief of staff?
Well, of course. I mean, the question of security clearance is gonna bother everybody because he is dealing with classified material, and that cannot go on indefinitely.
Okay. All right. Boyd and Gray, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
When we come back, another brief government shutdown ended as the president signs bipartisan budget deal. But did Democrats exact too high a price for the Republican boost in military spending?
This budget deal will be the best thing we've done for our economy, our military, our middle class for a long time.
A brief government shutdown, compliments of Kentucky Senator Rand Paul, ended Friday morning when President Trump signed a bipartisan budget agreement. The two-year deal would lift defense spending by $80 billion in 2018 and another $85 billion in 2019, making good on a central Republican campaign promise. But busting those spending caps for the military came at a high price, with Democrats winning an additional $131 billion in funding for domestic programs over the next 2 years. We're back with Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henniger, editorial board member Lisa Finley, and editorial page writer and budget follower Kate Batchelder Odell for her sins. That's been your beat. So let's go through the good, the bad, and the ugly. What's good in this?
Okay, so first, Paul, I think that the defense caps had to be broken because the damage to the military due to the sequester caps over the past few years has been pronounced. We've seen equipment issues, maintenance failures, and the most pronounced is that personnel don't get the training they need, and over time they are not ready for promotion and et cetera. So
big victory there, you think, for the Republicans?
I think so. It's unfortunate that it came at such a high price, but I will also add it gave me some confidence to see Jim Mattis say that the Pentagon will earn the public's trust on how they spend this money, because the Defense Department has been famous for wasting money.
This is the Defense Secretary. Okay. What else is good in it? Anything?
Well, Republicans did get a discrete policy victory in repealing the Obamacare Death Panels Board, which the public hates, and it represents everything the public doesn't like about Obamacare.
This was the board that was set up to basically impose price controls within Medicare. And it was designed in a way by the Obama central planners so that Congress virtually had no say in stopping those cuts.
Right, it was very insulated from the political accountability, and it was unelected bureaucrats, basically. That's why people hated it. So
a Federal Reserve for budget cuts, for health care cuts, in essence.
Right, no, so that's basically, though, the end of the good, because there is a lot of bad. Democrats extracted a high price, and they got $20 billion for infrastructure. Who knows where that will go? Broadband, water projects, right? They got community health centers. They got additional 4 years of children's health insurance. They got $6 billion for opioids, which obviously this should be a GOP priority, but it's not clear exactly what this money will accomplish or how it'll be spent, and just a laundry list of stuff.
Okay, Alicia, expand on that, and sort of what do you think? I mean, what does this big burst of domestic spending mean?
Well, it's going to be the new baseline budget, essentially, and heaven forbid we enter another recession another couple of years, and the deficit's just going to explode even more. Right now, we're heading to $1 trillion deficit. That's about double, but this will add another probably $1 trillion in debt. Eventually, there will have to be a reckoning. But entitlements, we have to look at entitlements, which actually constitute 2/3 of the budget.
And this budget deal doesn't really do anything like that. This focused on essentially changing the terms of the 2001 budget deal that Obama did with John Boehner. And so the domestic spending that Kate talked about, these are all so-called discretionary accounts: transportation, education, health care, a whole variety of things, but Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, off the table.
That's right. Student loans, for that matter, that's a mandatory expenditure, too. That's off the table.
All right. So, Dan, $1 trillion deficit. Last year, the budget deficit was $660 billion last fiscal year. We're headed to $1 trillion.
Right. And so conservatives in the House say they abhor this. They were threatening to shut down the government. Senator Rand Paul did so temporarily for a while in the middle of the night. But what is the bottom? There's a couple of bottom lines here. Literally, Paul, you only have 51 seats in the Senate. They lost that one in Alabama. And so they're not going to be able to pass a fiscally austere budget on their own, and they're not going to get it through the House. And Republicans are looking at the fact that they have to reset in November when they run for election again, hold the House, hopefully, if not lose the House, and at least hold those 51 seats in the Senate. And that is based on whether the Congress can perform. They passed the tax bill. They had the momentum. The Democrats got blamed for the first shutdown. And the question here was, were the Republicans going to show they could execute? They were in a tough spot.
Well, and that's what I think for a lot of viewers out there saying, well, why did they have to accept that, Kate? And the real answer is Democrats had leverage because Republicans don't have 60 Senate seats.
No, that's true. And also, you have to consider this in what were the alternatives. And the House was also rapidly losing support for these stopgap continuing resolution measures to kind of kick the can and try to get a better deal, right? So they did not have a lot of options, and it makes one wonder if the Senate should pass appropriation bills with 51 votes as opposed to 60.
What was Nancy Pelosi up to this week, Alicia? She did an 8-hour speech on the House floor saying, vote against this bill unless it includes legalization for the Dreamers. In the end, her own caucus, half of them abandoned her.
Right. It really showed her as a weak leader. This really undermined her leadership. I think she was actually trying to kind of throw a bone to the left flank of her caucus, and she's been under a lot of pressure. And you have to consider that, well, if Democrats do take the House in this next year, you know, she may face a leadership challenge. So she really had to kind of show that she was standing up to Donald Trump.
Okay, so you think this was about her leadership next year and her ability to return as Speaker if they win the House?
Right. Well, I think it backfired.
Because she couldn't.
She still didn't muster. I mean, maybe 70 some odd Democrats still voted for it.
Right. Okay. And Paul Ryan did get the majority of his Republican conference for the bill. And there was some doubt about that for a while. Okay. Still ahead, a bumpy ride on Wall Street as volatility returns to the stock market. So what's behind this week's swings? And is it the new normal? A bumpy ride on Wall Street with the Dow Jones Industrial Average experiencing its biggest one-day point drop ever on Monday, followed by a turbulent week of ups and downs. President Trump, who has frequently touted the stock market's rise since his election, weighed in on the turmoil, tweeting, quote, "In the old days, when good news was reported, the stock market would go up. Today, when good news is reported, the stock market goes down. Big mistake. And we have so much good, great news about the economy." We're back with Dan Henninger, Kim Strassel, and James Freeman. So, James, how worried should investors be about this correction?
Well, I think the president's right that this really was triggered by good news. The economy is doing well, and people expect that means higher interest rates than we thought, and therefore a threat, people think. Obviously, interest rates tend to be higher. We're getting back to a normal, healthy economy, though, and if you separate the markets, which I know are kind of gut-churning for a lot of people lately, the news of U.S. economy, global economy is good, and the news on corporate earnings is good.
All right, Mr. Sunshine here. Dan, are you, a cloudy day or what?
Well, a reality check, all right? I mean, if you're Donald Trump, naturally you think that the stock market, while you're president, should just go steadily upward forever, right?
Sure. But rates and interest rates should stay at less than 1% forever.
Right. Well,
he's a real estate guy. Remember,
but
they all love low rates.
Those low rates, that 1% or less, is kind of, I think, at the root of what is going on here now. We had the suppression by central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan for 8 years, a conscious suppression of interest rates to drive assets into the stock market, right?
Right.
And this was kind of the greatest monetary policy experiment in the history of the world. It had to end, but Trump has a contribution. He did all that deregulation, big tax cut, released the real economy, which has taken off in the last couple of months. And now you see the markets trying to get an alignment between the real economy and the sort of suppressed economy they were living with for 8 years. And it's going to be a rocky ride.
Right, because you have actually a normal market pricing, James, for bond prices for a change. So you've got the 10-year going up, so suddenly there's more risk involved. That's what happens. But it means that if you've been pushing investors into risk assets artificially, so maybe as this unwinds, you get investors going out.
Yeah, there is obviously risk, as you said. I think Trump's program on tax cuts and deregulation is the best way to try and transition back to a real economy. And I would say if you're looking for things that are bubbles, I would look at European and Japanese government debt more than the U.S. Stock market. But look, stocks have not been cheap. They've been getting a little cheaper lately. But if you believe in the long-term of the American economy, and I think it's gotten easier to believe in that lately, then you're probably not all that concerned.
A little blowback, Kim, for the Republicans, though, because of the president's touting stocks for so long. He got in the State of the Union. He said, "Oh, look at your 401k. It's fabulous." Well, I've been looking at my 401k. It's less than fabulous. Less fabulous today than it was 10 days ago. So, I mean, on the other hand, most Americans don't really, they don't invest in the stock market. And one of the reasons I would argue Donald Trump got elected was because what the Fed did was it drove people into risk assets that rich people had, okay? So they benefited from the stock market more than the average American worker did. And now if the real economy is going to take a handoff and do better, then, that's probably the kind of thing we need to have a better mood in the country and more people getting wealthier, not just the people at the top.
Well, right. And look at why the market has all of these interest rate fears. It's because the labor market has been tightening and wages have been going up. It's because manufacturing are doing a lot more investing and increasing output, and they're sucking up more commodities, driving the prices of those up. Those are the things that the Fed is going to pay attention to and may indeed result in higher interest rates. But the lesson here for the Republicans is that they need, and President Trump, is that they need to be out talking about how they have helped inspire some of this recent uptick in terms of the tax cuts and deregulation and everything else that is resulting in more jobs, higher wages, and growth in the country.
All right, James, do you think they're going to, I mean, that's a great suggestion. The problem is we're talking about other things. The president's talking about other things, Mueller, whatever the president tweets, parades down Pennsylvania Avenue for the military.
Well, look, I think there's a lot of good news in the private economy. If you're going to be worried about interest rates, and they have often been higher in history, I think maybe the politicians ought to be worrying a little bit more about them, because it's going to be harder to fund all of the stuff they love to spend money on if you get rates that are 3, 4, 5% on the 10-year Treasury bond, which they easily could be.
Yeah, but you can't. If you're the Fed, you've got to start looking at if the economy's that strong. You can't just sit down and say, oh yeah, well, we don't care. Let's stay at 1 forever. Let's stay at 1.5 forever. You got to go up.
That's right, and that's why ultimately, although this is a different market than we're used to, it is more volatile. This is progress to move back to an economy not dominated by Washington and the Fed, but by private decision making.
All right, thank you all. Still ahead, amid talks of an Olympic thaw, the U.S. issues a new warning to North Korea.
The United States of America will soon unveil the toughest and most aggressive round of economic sanctions on North Korea ever. We will not allow North Korean propaganda to hijack the message and imagery of the Olympic Games. We will not allow North Korea to hide behind the Olympic banner the reality that they enslave their people and threaten the wider region.
That was Vice President Mike Pence in Tokyo this week during a stopover on his way to the Winter Olympics in South Korea. The vice president warning North Korea that the U.S. is set to unveil its toughest sanctions yet, amid what some are describing as an Olympic thaw between Pyongyang and Seoul. The North sent a high-level delegation to the Games that includes Kim Jong-un's younger sister, who extended an invitation Saturday for South Korean President Moon Jae-in to attend talks in Pyongyang, setting the stage for the first meeting of Korean leaders in more than a decade. John Bolton is the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
So, look, it looks to me like the last 2-3 weeks have been a propaganda windfall for North Korea. Would you agree?
Absolutely. They've pulled an old playbook out of their desk drawer. They did this in the 2000 Olympics, the 2004 Olympics, the 2006 Olympics, under governments in South Korea, basically similar in policy to President Moon, the current government in South Korea, and they're doing it again. And they're getting the same reaction from the Western media as they are from a lot of naive and gullible people in South Korea. This Olympics charade means absolutely nothing when it comes to North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Tragically, they are continuing their progress while people are oohing and eyeing about the women's ice hockey teams of North and South Korea playing together.
Well, I mean, they've got a girl band in North Korea. Send a girl band to Seoul. I mean, as if it's almost as if the North is trying to use this to say, look, we're just a normal country, okay? Nothing to see here. We're not really isolated. Just treat us normally. And I think they're winning, John. I really do.
They absolutely are. And I tell you, I think it might be worse. You know, my colleague at AEI, Nick Eberstadt, has a great article in the current Commentary magazine talking about how many times, among other things, how many times South Korea over the past 15 years has subsidized North Korea under the mistaken view that if they only give them enough money, everything will work out. You have to ask the question, did President Moon of South Korea subsidize or provide other economic incentives for the North Koreans to do this? I'm very worried the answer to that might be yes, which means that with a little help from their friends, Kim Jong-un and his regime are actually empowered, not just the propaganda victory, but have received economic benefits.
Did the U.S., I'm talking about President Trump and the administration, have any choice, however, except to basically go along with what President Moon of South Korea wanted in this? Because, you know, they have a huge stake in the Olympics going well, and you didn't want to have the U.S. somehow interfere with that. So what choice did the U.S. have as a policy, political matter?
No, I don't think there was any choice. I put this down again to the North Koreans' propaganda skill. The games are in South Korea, obviously. We have sent Vice President Pence on a very difficult and sensitive mission to try and show unity with South Korea, with Japan, but also, as he said, not to allow North Korea to have a completely open field for their propaganda efforts. And so I think he's got a difficult job, but it's important that we remind people that behind all this blue smoke and mirrors, the nuclear and ballistic missile programs are continuing.
One of the things that the administration is doing, seems to be doing with Vice President Pence as a strategy is starting to put human rights on the table. That is how North Korea treats its own people and visitors. So Otto Warmbier, the father of the man that the North Koreans killed after they prevented him from leaving the country, he's going to attend with Mike Pence. The president met this week with some human rights activists and defectors from North Korea at the White House. That's a turn from the Obama administration and I think also the George W. Bush administration, which didn't like to talk about human rights in North Korea.
Well, I think the characteristics of the rogue states that we worry about around the world, and I include Iran along with North Korea, they oppress their own people, they engage in international terrorism, and they pursue weapons of mass destruction. So I think that President Trump is well advised to find whatever arguments he can to try and show just how bad this regime is, because notwithstanding the Vice President's announcement of even stricter sanctions, I don't think we have time for sanctions to work. I think we're down to some very hard choices. Let me just say, as an alumnus of the Bush 43 administration, look at the past 18 years. How many times have you heard one administration after another say tough new sanctions on North Korea? What have we been doing for 18 years that there are any tough new sanctions left to apply? That's why I think we're perilously close to the end of this road here. The president's got a hard decision about whether to use military force or whether to acquiesce in North Korea becoming a nuclear weapons state.
Well, I think, Ambassador, what they'd say is that we're going to start to slap sanctions on Chinese companies that do business and other companies in Asia that do business with North Korea and say your choice is this. You either keep doing business with North Korea or you do business with us. You can't have it both ways. That's what I think this is going.
That may be. If we had done that 15 years ago, it might make a difference. CIA Director Mike Pompeo said several times that North Korea is perhaps a handful of months away from being able to target thermonuclear weapons on cities in the United States. So do we have a year for this secondary sanctions effort to proceed? I'm not sure we do. We don't have 5 years or 10 years, that's for sure. We're down to counting on our fingers and toes, I'm afraid, how close